In the summer heat of 636, a river would decide the fate of an empire. The battle at al-Qadisiyyah was not merely a clash of arms. It was a collision between an exhausted imperial order and a confederation of mobile warriors whose momentum carried them from desert into empire. What happened there reshaped borders, polities, and the lives of millions across the Fertile Crescent. By then, three older worlds, Byzantium, the Sassanian realm, and the patchwork of Arabic tribes, had been forced into a new calculus by decades of war, religious ferment, and shifting loyalties. The Sassanian state, bruised by years of conflict with Byzantium and torn by internal factionalism, faced mounting financial strain and fractious noble houses. By then, three older worlds, Byzantium, the Sassanian realm, and the patchwork of Arabic tribes, had been forced into a new calculus by decades of war, religious ferment, and shifting loyalties. The Sassanian state, bruised by years of conflict with Byzantium and torn by internal factionalism, faced mounting financial strain and fractious noble houses. Byzantium, led by Heraclius, had been drained, though it still controlled the Levant and Anatolia. Opposite them stood the nascent Caliphate, recently unified under Abu Bakr and then Umar, drawing on tribal levies, religious zeal, and a style of leadership that fused political consolidation with battlefield initiative. Key figures who appear across sources in the run-up to Qadisiyyah include Khalid ibn al-Walid, the cavalry commander whose name alone carried weight; Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the field commander at Qadisiyyah according to most early chronicles; the Persian king Yazdegerd III, and his general Rostam. The stage was set for a contest of logistics, command, and nerve. If you find this topic compelling, stay to the end, and please subscribe, like, and ring the bell to support more deep dives like this one. The narrative that follows threads contemporary reports, partisan chronicles, and modern interpretation. Where sources diverge on troop counts, on the precise role of particular commanders, on tactical details, those differences are noted. Some claims come from later Arabic tradition and should be read with caution. Modern scholars often prefer more constrained estimates. In the months before Qadisiyyah, the Arab armies had already proved themselves in the Syrian theater. Khalid ibn al-Walid had earned a formidable reputation there. Quick in movement, untroubled by risk, and skilled at using cavalry to turn engagements into routs. His victories on the Levantine steppe were decisive in bringing Damascus and other cities under caliphal influence. Yet by late 635 and into 636, the focus shifted to the east. In Mesopotamia, the Sassanian center still lay at Ctesiphon, a city that embodied Persian imperial continuity. Its palaces, fortified bridges, and leveled banks of the Tigris stood as a reminder that the empire could still marshal resources when nobles united. In practice, however, unity was rare. The Sassanian nobility's rivalries, the flight of capable leaders, and the death or exile of senior commanders in prior campaigns had left the Persian military more brittle than its outward strength suggested. Qadisiyyah itself lay near a bend of the Euphrates, where river and reed-lined banks shaped the battlefield. For the invading Arab armies, the river was both obstacle and objective. Control of crossings meant control of supply lines and the ability to threaten Ctesiphon. The plain around Ctesiphon offered room for cavalry maneuvers. The nearby reeds and orchards provided scarce shade, and the glare off the water made midday operations punishing. Persian forces under Rostam brought to the field a different set of advantages: disciplined infantry units, armored cavalry, and, crucially, war elephants, beasts that functioned as both shock weapons and mobile fortresses, their noses and trunks smeared with oil and armor in the photographs of chroniclers' imaginations. Sources repeatedly emphasize the psychological as much as the physical effect of elephants. Later Arabic tradition frames them as something to be overcome by Muslim ingenuity. Modern historians caution that the impact of elephants was variable, and that they could be as much a liability as terrain and morale shifted. Troop numbers remain contested. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts offer tallies that often reflect rhetorical aims rather than reliable counting. Some Persian or Byzantine sources claim an overwhelmingly superior Persian force, while later Muslim chronicles suggest a smaller, more agile Arab army triumphant against daunting odds. Modern estimates typically place the Arab forces in the range of several thousand to perhaps tens of thousands, while Persian forces likely numbered higher, possibly in the tens of thousands, but precise figures are elusive. Where the sources provide strikingly high or low numbers, they are cited as partisan claims and should be weighed against logistical plausibility. Supply lines, the capacity of the plain to accommodate large infantry masses, and the number of cavalry that could be mounted in a desert fringe environment. Khalid's relation to Ctesiphon is complicated by time and by the politics of memory. Early Arabic historians like al-Tabari record narratives that place Khalid in several theaters. Later traditions sometimes credit him with presence or influence at Ctesiphon. Yet the most consistent contemporary outline attributes command to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas for the Muslim field army at Ctesiphon. Modern scholars treat claims of Khalid's direct command at Ctesiphon as debatable. Some argue that his talents were crucial in the overall strategic picture. His campaigns in Syria distracted Persian attention, or his reputation affected enemy dispositions, without implying he was on the Euphrates bank as a decisive commander. The safest reading, based on available evidence, is that Khalid's military persona loomed over the campaign, even if he did not lead the main Arab contingents at Ctesiphon in person. The Untold story is thus partly the story of reputation as a force multiplier. To understand what unfolded at the river, the composition of both camps matters. The Arab host was in reality a coalition: Bedouin horsemen prized for speed and shock, tribal foot levies used to garrison towns, and a developing cadre of commanders appointed by the Caliphate to impose discipline and organization. Their logistical system was rudimentary compared to imperial standards, but adaptable. Local requisition, camel trains, and the ability to live off pasture when necessary. Persian forces, by contrast, still relied on a chain of provincial recruitment, fortified towns, and revenues that, when collected, supported heavier armament, armor, and siege materiel. But in practice, revenue flows had been interrupted. The Sassanian center's ability to project sustained power was constrained by internal politics and the dispersal of noble retinues across multiple fronts. The approach to the battle was as much political as tactical. For the Caliphate, victory at al-Qadisiyyah would open the road to Ctesiphon and deliver a symbolic blow to Persian prestige. For the Persians, holding the Euphrates crossings was a way to deny the Arabs an inexorable march into the imperial heartland. Both sides understood that control of rivers and bridges mattered more than field glory. Control of a ford could determine supply and retreat. The morning the armies faced one another, the air carried the mixed odors of horse sweat, cooking fires, and prepared weapons. On the Arab side, commanders moved among encampments, issuing terse orders. Men adjusted bridles, retied sandals, and checked shields for cracks. Khalid, if present in any advisory capacity or as a looming figure in the minds of the Arab troops, was remembered in chronicles for a posture that mixed impatience with precision. He favored mobility, cavalry screens to probe, feigned retreats to unravel enemy cohesion, sudden charges to pry open formations. Where he is described directly in sources, small gestures are emphasized. A hand on a rein, a nod to a subordinate, a glance that cut through static plans and found the seam in a formation. Those vignettes humanize him without recasting him as an omniscient general. He was decisive, not infallible. Rostam, leading the Persian side, embodied the old order. Sources present him as experienced, a noble accustomed to coordination among heavy infantry, horsemen, and elephants. His challenge was to meld these elements into a coherent defense that could both blunt cavalry and hold the riverbank. Persian armor, scale and lamellar protection, long lances for shock and pikes for infantry cohesion, contrasted with the lighter mail and leather seen among many Arab fighters. The Persians sought to use depth and mass to absorb cavalry strikes, to anchor on the river as a stabilizing flank, and to deploy elephants where they could break lines or at least stall charges long enough for infantry to close. Tactically, the early phases resembled a classic contest of mobility versus mass.
Arab cavalaria dartou para testar holding lines. Persian infantry strutted into squares and used spearmen to create an hedge against mounted assault. The elephants, tethered and armored, were positioned where their mass could be most effective, near the center or flanks, depending on terrain. Sources record periods of skirmishing, of missiles launched from both sides, of attempts to unhorse officers. Casualties in these probes were usually light compared to a full engagement, but each wounded leader or lost standard shifted morale. The turning point, as the chronicles narrated, came in a sequence of risky gambits and improvisation. Arab commanders, confronting elephants for the first time on such a scale, experimented with methods. Concentrated missile volleys to panic or wound the animals, targeting mahouts, elephant drivers, where possible, and attempting to create trenches or ditches to break elephant charges. Later Arabic accounts include stories, flagged as tradition, that single out moments of personal bravery where a commander rode directly at an elephant's flank, severing ropes or slashing at its attendants. Modern scholars caution that such anecdotes often carry the flavor of heroic storytelling. They may compress multiple small actions into a single memorable tableau. What appears more probable, given military logistics, is that elephants were disabled or driven off by a combination of concentrated missile fire, disciplined infantry creating physical barriers, and episodes where the animals, once wounded or fearful, turned and upset their own ranks. As combat intensified, command and control became the decisive factor. The Arab forces' ability to rotate fresh units and to maintain cohesion under shock depended on local leadership and on a flatter command structure that could adapt quickly. Persian formations, accustomed to set-piece battles and reliant on rigid cohesion, could be strained by repeated probes that forced local commanders to commit reserves piecemeal. That piecemeal commitment is one of the key elements scholars suggest contributed to Persian difficulties. When reserves are consumed to plug a breach, an enemy that preserves impetus can find a final seam. Morale threaded through each moment. For Persian troops, the sight of an elephant felled by sustained fire could be demoralizing. For Arab fighters, witnessing a commander fall or a unit break could be terrifying. Yet the latter also contained the opposite effect, that personal risk and the immediacy of leadership often galvanized small units to extraordinary steadiness. Saad's alleged calm on the field, how different sources depict it, becomes important here. Whether his steadiness was innate or partly constructed in later retellings, it served as a focal point for the army's resilience. The interplay of fear, hope, and command presence drove decisions on both sides. The day drifted toward a grinding afternoon, the Euphrates glittering like an indifferent witness.
At times, the fighting clustered around strategic localities, the crossing points, orchard lines, and reed beds. Both camps scavenged whatever local intelligence they could. Scouts returned with fragmentary reports, local villagers offered rumors, and commanders had to judge the reliability of such information. In the blurred fog of war, a single misread, an overestimate of enemy strength, a delayed countercharge, a misrouted relay of orders could precipitate collapse. When the Persian center finally showed fissures, the collapse tended to be local rather than wholesale. A broken infantry line here, a routed cavalry squadrons there, and suddenly commanders faced the impossible choice of committing reserves into an already disordered posture, or holding them to protect the core. The latter sometimes invited encirclement, the former often exhausted last reserves. Partisan narratives attribute dramatic single-moment breakthroughs to individual heroes. A more measured reading sees a cumulative erosion of cohesion, small setbacks aggregating until a flank folded and the line snapped. The immediate aftermath of battle carried consequences beyond the field. Prisoners, wounded, and the handling of the dead had practical and political effects. Sources state that many were killed or enslaved, though figures and the scale of enslavement are reported differently across chronicles. Where sources report mass executions, modern historians urge caution and point out the logistical and political limits on such actions. Conversely, the taking of captives and redistribution of wealth did occur, and fed the narratives of victory that circulated afterward. The psychological effect on Sassanian governance was blunt. A major field defeat near the river loosened the imperial grip on Mesopotamia and made a strike at Ctesiphon plausible to the invaders. Strategically, the fall of an engagement at al-Qadisiyyah did not instantly topple the Sassanian state, but it opened the corridor to the heartland. It compelled Persian nobles to reassess loyalties, to retreat to strongholds, or to seek accommodation. It also permitted the Caliphate to establish forward bases, garrison towns, and impose tributary arrangements, measures that became the seeds of longer-term administrative change. The early caliphal response was not merely plunder. It involved tax arrangements, garrison placements, and the appointment of governors to oversee newly subdued territories. These administrative measures, concise in description but heavy in consequence, began to reorganize the political landscape in ways that would endure beyond the immediate campaign. Yet, the story of Khalid within this narrative is, in some ways, a story of legend.
Where direct evidence of his presence at Qadisiyyah is thin or contested, his shadow remains. Tactical principles he favored, the morale his name could inspire, and the broader strategic pressure his earlier Eastern and Western campaigns exerted on enemy dispositions. The process by which military memory accretes around charismatic figures is itself a force in history. Commanders who succeed early can have their reputations amplify later achievements in ways that obscure the more distributed reality of command. These complexities of contested sources, of the interplay between legend and recorded fact, of tactical detail and political consequence, are why the Battle of al-Qadisiyyah resists a single tidy narrative. What follows next is a closer, moment-by-moment reconstruction of the engagement, as plausibly as sources allow, an examination of competing accounts about Khalid's role, and an assessment of how Qadisiyyah fit into the wider collapse of centralized Sassanian resistance. We will look at logistics, how supplies moved across a summer plain, how command hierarchies were organized, and at the smaller human scenes that illuminate decisions. A commander pausing to drink from the Euphrates, a standard-bearer refusing to flee, an elephant wounded and turning back on its own infantry. Time and place, late 636, the Euphrates plain near al-Qadisiyyah. The next stages of the story follow the dawn exchanges that set the tempo for the fateful afternoon, and the episodes that would be stitched into later memory as either proof of Khalid's genius or as testimony to a collective Arab effort led by Sa'd and others. The chronicles that bind these episodes range from dispatches by provincial governors to later annalists who shaped narratives for audiences who wanted both instruction and heroism. Their differences are not mere quibbling. They determine how later generations saw the conquest and which names were elevated into exempla. Holding these caveats in view, the reconstruction continues. Scouts reported the first Persian lines at the riverbank. Arab horsemen tested the fords. Orders were relayed in the thin morning light, and the first elephants moved like slow tides across a plain that had not seen such beasts in recent memory. The interplay of spear and lance, of disciplined infantry and darting cavalry, of command risk and improvisation would define the hours to come. Scouts brought word in small, urgent bursts, men on horseback with dust in their nostrils, faces shut against the sun, returning to the commander's tents to unroll the contour of the plain. They spoke of the Persian ranks drawn along the far bank, of wagons stacked with shields, of ivory heads thrust above the infantry line. The fords were shallow in places. In others, the Euphrates ran deep and swift, a bright ribbon that could swallow a man ankle-deep in a single misstep. Sa'd moved among the captains with a steady patience. He listened, asked where the horses could ford, where the reeds made a crossing treacherous, assessed who was tired and who could ride another hour without breaking. Light cavalry, Arab horsemen who had learned to ride hard and shoot loose, were sent to test the river. They rode in small groups, probing, turning short upon the bank and loosing arrows.
The Persians answered in kind. Archers behind shields, archers from towers on wagons, the longbows of men accustomed to rain and mountain hunts. The air filled with the low hiss of missiles. When arrows met arrows, the noise was a steady, metallic whisper. When lances struck shields, it was sudden and loud, the sound of iron answering call. The elephants crossed with a dignity that made the ground seem petty by comparison. They came last in slow, deliberate pairs, their riders perched in towers of wood or leather, their trunks sweeping and shuffling. Each beast carried men who bellowed orders or beat drums. Their mahouts steered with confidence born of years. To the Arab eye, these were machines of terror, mass and motion concentrated into one living battering ram. To the Persians, they were veterans of frontier wars, accustomed to crush the line and make havoc where order had otherwise prevailed. At first, the elephants were used as a blunt instrument of weight. Persian commanders sought to press lanes through the Arab fringes. An elephant would move forward slowly, its towermen raining javelins into the compacted ranks. Behind it, pikemen pushed with long spears to widen a breach. Arabs responded not by standing still and meeting the charge with shields, for that would be to invite the crushing press, but by feint and fragmentation. Light horse dispersed, circled, and returned like swarms. When the elephant's mahout struck his prod into its flank, a cluster of riders would dart past the flank of the beast and try to harry its handlers, hoping to break the control between animal and rider. Small scenes gathered meaning. A standard-bearer in a plain linen tunic lifted his flag when the first Persian line pressed forward. The flag trembled with the weight of arrows that hissed around him, but he held the staff until a spear cracked the shaft near his knee. He did not fall then. He let himself slump, staunching blood with a strip of his garment, and his comrades closed ranks around him so that the color would not be lost. Later, the same standard would be scented with blood and dust, and would yet wave that evening as proof that the line had not broken. Saad's orders were crisp. He divided the front into segments, assigning men who could both hold and withdraw. Command and control of this kind was less about relays of messengers than about the instincts of captains, who had long served together, knowing when to give ground so that the enemy overran empty space, knowing when to press so that a skirmish line could be turned into a rout.
In one sector, a wedge of spearmen closed before a Persian sally, absorbing a push of shield and spear that bowed their line but did not shatter it. Men took breath. A captain called for a secondary line to fall in. Discipline of this sort was hard-won and fragile. When it held, it made success possible. The sagging of midday pressed men toward the river to drink. A commander, a man whose armor was marked with the soft indent of many repairs, took off his helmet and cupped his hands in the current. He drank slowly, as if measuring the taste of victory or defeat with each mouthful. Around him, a medic tended a boy with a shallow arrow wound and spoke of home in a voice like a rope pulling a boat back to shore. The smell of boiled barley and the grease of lamps braided through the plain. The Euphrates smelled of reeds and fish, a small insistence of life against the iron and blood. Tactically, the Arabs adapted to the elephants in the way one adapts to a new weather.
They learned that the beasts were intimidating but not invulnerable. The mahouts were critical nodes. Wound them, skewer them, unsettle them, and the beast might flail in confusion. Many of the small episodes recorded later in chronicles that sought drama grow from this practical truth. A detached party of horsemen would ride close enough to shoot into the elephant's howdah. Another, bolder, would attempt to wound the elephant's legs with spears aimed high so that the strike forced it to kneel or stumble. When an elephant stumbled, it did not simply collapse. It turned and attempted to trample whatever lay before it. On a plain that lacked the fortifications of a city, the unpredictable path of a wounded elephant could be as dangerous to Persian infantry as to Arabs. There was a moment, late morning, when the forward Persian line seemed to gather cohesion. Rostam's standards were visible across the marrow of the field, a compact dark knot, and the coordination of elephants with shield and archers suggested practice. A column of infantry advanced in disciplined ranks, shields overlapping like fish scales, as composite bowmen let fly in multiple strings. For a brief hour, the Sassanian line looked as though it might push the Arabs to the riverbank itself. That hour ended with the small violences of individual initiative. A Persian war elephant, struck by an arrow in the eye or the trunk, the chronicles seldom agree on the wound, began to rear. Its mahout beat with a thong. The elephant bellowed, a long, plaintive sound that passed like a shadow over men and horses. In the confusion of the beast's turning, a line of Persian spearmen were trampled or driven back, leaving an aperture that two Arab captains recognized and pressed. They rode through with a handful of men, struck at the exposed rear of the elephant's tower, and in the scramble toppled equipment and killed a subordinate commander. The elephant panicked and, instead of breaking toward the enemy, swung its mass into its own ranks.
This instant, one animal's panic did what months of argument and a dozen tactical plans could not. It introduced chaos into the Persian front. When elephants turned back, they often did so in ways that trampled their own shields and severed the compactness of lines. Men who had been ready to steady a formation found themselves fighting to avoid falling beneath the feet of an enormous creature. The Persian nobles, who had expected such beasts to guarantee a rout, now faced the paradox that their instruments of dominance could also undo them. Saad did not pursue a general order to charge. He did not need to. Field commanders of the Arab force seized the opportunity with the opportunism of men who choose the moment where risk becomes advantage. A vanguard pushed into the gap, while skirmishers harried the flanks, and archers concentrated on the rear of the rows. The Persian line, without its former cohesion, began to ripple and fold. Men fled in separate bands rather than as an organized withdrawal. In such dispersal, the chance to rally was slender. Yet even amid this turn, the outcome was not preordained. The Persians had reserves, horse squadrons on the flanks, and a second echelon of infantry that, if led well, absorb blows and attempt a counterstroke. Rostam, from what chroniclers claim, rode between ranks, though here the sources diverge on whether he was personally present at every breach or commanding from a seat further rearward. What is clear is that where Persian discipline held, it could blunt Arab assaults. Where Persian command frayed, where nobles retreated to save their own retinues, collapse followed quickly. On the ground, the cost was immediate. Bodies lay where they fell.
Others were wounded and dragged behind shields. Some captives were bound and moved toward the Arab lines, faces slack with exhaustion, hands tied with strips of cloth. The psychological effect of prisoners, murmured displays of their spoils, fed the morale of some Arab units and terrified those among the Persians who feared the shame of capture. But the taking of captives also slowed pursuit. Men who might have pressed an advantage turned to remove trappings and secure prizes, and this revealed how victory and its spoils worked at cross purposes. As the sun leaned toward the west, the plain changed its colors from a bright white to the softening gold of late afternoon. Commanders sent word to one another in the scratch of runners. Tactics shifted again. Skirmishers were recalled to conserve strength. The front lines were reformed where possible into new wrappings against renewed Persian pressure. Saad ordered that slings and archers be concentrated at points where elephants might again attempt to wedge a path. He asked for men to be ready to engage the animals' handlers rather than the beasts directly. It was a strategy of attrition, of picking at the modes of Persian power. Small human details persisted amid the artillery and maneuver.
A young soldier, barely bearded, clambered up a low hill to watch the river and saw his brother fighting among the shouts. They waved, and for a minute the war was an intimate thing, two men recognizing one another within the noise. An elderly man who had been pressed into place as a standard carrier refused to relinquish his post, even when a captain begged him to seek shelter. His face was creased with forges of other wars, and his hands clutched the staff as if it were the last proof of his life. The sight of such determination steadied others. By late afternoon, both sides carried wounds that would not be measured in mere numbers. The Sassanian command found itself re-evaluating the placement of its reserves. Persian nobles argued with one another, and where cohesion was weakest, detachments slipped away in the dusk, seeking the safety of fortified towns or simply fleeing to preserve family and wealth. On the other hand, the Arab force, though not without its fatigue and losses, had tasted a rout and understood its mechanics. What had begun as a morning of cautious probes and the jangle of bowstrings had matured into a set of options: press at once and exploit disarray, or consolidate and hope that the Persian line would not repair itself by dawn. At the center of the field, a wounded elephant lay, with one eye swollen and a mahout dead in the litter beside it. Men circled at a careful distance, some to strip the body for anything valuable, others to ensure the beast could not be turned to fresh use by an enemy party. The plain seemed to hold its breath around that animal. It had been both weapon and symbol, and in its collapse the narrative of the day found a single visible emblem. As night began to shade in, signals were sent along both lines. Fires were lit in controlled clusters to tend the wounded and to indicate positions. Commanders withdrew to their pavilions, temporary shelters of tent and rug, to consult maps and lists, to take stock. The day's fighting had been fierce but uneven. It had not decided the war. Yet it had carved contours into the two armies' prospects. The Arabs left the field with the confidence that their methods of mobility, initiative, and targeted strikes at enemy nodes could offset material advantages, such as elephants and armored infantry. The Persians left with the knowledge that command and the ability to rally nobles would be their critical scarce resource. Beyond the mechanics of maneuver, the battle had produced stories. Small, vivid, and quick to travel. There would be later accounts of particular acts,
men who stood when others fled, of a horseman who plunged into the rear of an elephant's column, of a Persian standard taken and borne away like a trophy. These stories would be folded into the larger memory of Qadisiyyah, each chronicler emphasizing what fit that writer's purpose: the valor of individuals, the errors of certain commanders, the role of providence or of cunning.
For now, as stars pricked the plain and the Euphrates whispering on its banks, the next day's possibilities were being weighed in councils and in the quiet prayers of soldiers who had survived. In the morning, there would be decisions to make that could not be postponed: whether to renew a massed attack, how to allocate the tired reserve, who among the nobles could be trusted to hold the next line. These decisions, choices of timing and faith in men, were as consequential as any flank maneuver. What had unfolded during the daylight hours had opened corridors for both opportunity and peril. The coming moves would test whether the Arab commanders could transform tactical advantage into strategic consequence, and whether the Sassanian leadership could find the cohesion to close those corridors once more. Dawn came like a thin wash of cold light over the plain. The fires that had burned through the night sputtered low but did not die. Men moved among them with blankets thrown about their shoulders, rubbing cold from their limbs, propping bandages, turning faces toward the river. Mist clung close to the ground where the Euphrates sighed. Beyond it, the line of Persian tents stood as a darker horizon, their standards whipping once in the wind and then hanging slack. The Arab camp was less regular. Smaller pavilions, men sleeping where they had fallen, horses tethered in loose knots, but its commanders showed no lack of order. There was a quick, efficient business to preparing for what would be asked of men that day. At the center of the Arab command, beneath a fly-cloth pinned to poles, the leaders gathered around a low table. It was not a council of long oratory. The events of the previous day had made the choices blunt and real. Saad, if his name was used among them, it was with the plain reverence befitting one who was responsible now for the line, sat with a map rolled and unrolled by the wind. He looked older than he had the week before, the morning's events already furrowing new channels into his face. Beside him, veterans who had seen war in other provinces spoke in short sentences. How the Persian reserves had been shifted, which noble houses showed fracture, which detachments had slipped off into the dusk. The commanders counted on what the eye had shown, and on the rumor that moved faster than messengers, that Persian cohesion was not what it pretended to be. "Elephants," one said. "They have lost an angle. Their crews are frightened. If we press straight now, they will not hold them in proper formation. Cut them off from their rear. If the crews cannot be rallied, the beasts become obstacles to their own army." Another voice, young, sharp, argued for caution. "We have men weary. The reserves may stand. And if we commit in mass and they rally in the center, we cannot recover. Better to harass, to pick, to make their lines thin again by night, and strike hard when they weaken." Saad folded the map and did not rush an answer. He looked past the table to the plain, where small groups of men were already forming into ranks. The smoke from the trines and from fires rising and merging with the mist. Between the two counsellings, press and consolidate, was the throat of risk. He thought of the young soldier who had waved from a hill the day before, of the standard carrier who would not leave his post. The hope of turning a tactical advantage into strategic consequence felt like something owed to those faces. Finally, he spoke. To press, but with economy. A portion would move with speed and strike the nodes, the elephant crews, the baggage, the nobles' pavements where standards flew, while the bulk held a ready center, prepared to blunt any counter. A feint, then a convergent push. Each detachment received its orders in clipped commands. Men strapped up, grit in their teeth, and the plain found its breath again. Across the river, in the Persian pavilions, night had not been so calm. The nobles argued as men with fortunes at stake do, not only over tactics, but over blame. Rostam, tall, stern, a figure whose name carried in the mouths of men like the weight of an inheritance, moved between voices and at times silenced them with the mere firmness of his posture. He had the look of a man for whom failure had an acuteness that burned inward. He did not like surprises, and yesterday the Arabs had given him one. The reserves must hold, he said when he could be heard. We will rebuild the center. Bring up the armored horse. If they think to cut at our elephants, they will be made into stumbling hills. We will force them back by the press of steel. A noble countered that the loyalty of the cavalry could not be assumed. Some had already signaled reluctance, their men withdrawn to tend wounds, to take stock of what remained of their households. Another argued for a measured withdrawal to a fortified town, carrying the elephants forward to break any pursuit. Rostam's face did not show panic, but his hand closed once on a spear, and the knuckles shone white. He could not afford to retreat. To give ground would be to invite the rumor of weakness that would multiply in the outlying provinces. Better to make victory, or to die trying, he thought, than to have his name turned into a tale of timidity. Messengers flitted between the tents, some bound with speed and urgency, others with the slackness of men who had already conceded the unpleasant truth that command could summon, but loyalty might not follow. Rostam sent out orders to tighten formations, to place fresh guards with standards, to post riders along the river to watch for Arab maneuvers. But outside the tents, the calm of the plain held gusts of indecision. Detachments moved as if not certain whom to obey. Some nobles rode to their own banners and did not return. When the first alarm came, a distant clatter of hooves and the feathering of arrows, the Persian line stiffened.
The Arabs.
This detachment struck like a trap sprung. The Persian cavalry, taken on the flank, staggered. A noble's horse went down under him. A standard slipped from a soldier's hand and skittered across the sand. The sight of the standard falling, an emblem of a lineage more than a convenient cloth, breathed into the Arab lines a kind of fervor. Men who had seen the fallen standard the day before now saw new cause. Among those in the Arab ranks was the young soldier who had watched his brother from the hill. He had not come for glory. He had come for the simple and savage business of staying alive and bringing back his own. When the rear of the Persian horse wavered, he rode with a small party that had been kept in reserve for precisely such an opening. They came upon the noble who had lost his horse and found him mounted already on another, trying to rally men who were already thinning. A short, fierce clash followed, edged with scraping metal and shouted names. In that melee, the young soldier saw his brother wedged into the press, sword raised against two men. Instinct pushed him forward. Blood fogs the edges of reckoning and turns a man into a blade. It was the kind of fighting that did not allow for long speeches. A man struck a blow and was struck in return. A horse bucked and slipped. A standard-bearer tumbled, clutching the staff like a last proof. The young soldier's brother fell with a sound like a rope breaking. For a second, the whole world was a small, sharp point of grief. Then something larger took over, something disciplined and hard, the necessity to act, to seize, to secure. The young soldier saw an opening beside the fallen standard and took it, wrenching the staff free and tearing the cloth from its fittings. He could not know if the capture of that standard would by itself change the destiny of the day, but to him it was proof that he had answered some call. On the center left, the Persian line groaned under the attrition. Noble upon noble tried to reform squadrons that no longer had the numbers to be menacing. Rostam felt the press of his own weariness and the weight of the empire in its creak. He had come to the field prepared to die rather than to turn, yet he had not intended to die with ignominy. He rallied what close and trusted companions he could find, and spearheaded a charge meant to slice the Arab thrust in two. They struck with the fury of men who know that sometimes only the suddenness of aggression will re-establish order. The clash in the center was terrible in its simplicity. Horses reared, spears splintered, men fell with their faces turned to the sky, mouths open in the sudden shock of pain. Around them the plain became a maw of bodies and feathered banners. For a time the Persian wedge pushed. Men followed Rostam like a current follows its headwater. His presence was a stubborn fact, and facts shaped men.
He cut toward where the Arab command was thought to be, toward the low table and the flycloth where leaders confer and decisions bloom into motion. If the center could be struck and the leaders of the Arabs disordered, the momentum might swing. Yet the Arabs had not placed their command lightly. Saad had anticipated such a desperate stroke and had arrayed a second line, a ring of hardened men whose purpose was not to charge but to hold the point of decision. As Rostam's wedge closed, those defenders met it with a serried, patient resistance. Spears met shields, the clang of metal sang a high, bitter note that rose above the cries. Rostam's horse reared and went down under him amid the crush. He recovered, mounted another steed, and drove on. Men around him kept falling, and his breath came like someone carrying a great load up a hill. It was there, amid the central chaos, where blood and dust and sun made all things unclear, that Rostam took a wound he would not live from. The details of such moments are later embroidered by chroniclers to suit their aims. Who threw the spear, whom it struck, which exact instant ended a life? In the plain itself, truth is simpler and crueler. A lance, tipped and thrown with the whole of a man's strength, found a gap at the base of his throat. Rostam staggered, hands grasping at the air as if loss of command could be kept by will alone. His companions dragged him from his horse and made a small shelter of bodies around him, even as the press of battle sought to break any human ring. For a moment the world narrowed to the shape of Rostam's face and the eyes of those who crouched close. He did not cry out with any plaintive speech. His mouth worked, and kingship and the tone of an old order seemed to pass through him like a last wind. Around him, the Persian line noticed the falter as if a bell had been struck. News travels faster through bodies than by messenger. A fall in the center is a message that reaches ears and heart at once. Some men who had been uncertain hardened and returned to the line. Others looked and found their courage shaken to its roots. Across the plain, an Arab warrior saw the spectacle, the mortal fall of the man who had directed so much of the day's weight. And for a sliver of time he thought of his brother, of the standard he had captured, of the way the world sometimes balanced on a single blade. He did not know Rostam's name, yet he knew the effect of a leader fallen, the drag of terror, the emptying away of a people's heart. He thought of the man beside him who had lost a father in previous skirmishes, and of how the day took away everything small and meaningful. So he did not stop to claim the grace of victory as a private prize. He rode forward with others to press advantage, to make the small fact of a fallen commander into a larger turning. Rostam's shelter of men fought to move him away from where the press threatened to swallow all.
They carried him toward the relative safety of a tent where colors were still held. But in that short distance the world remained perilous. The Arabs surged through, sampling the fear and converting it to cold force. A Persian standard slipped from a mad, wounded hand and tumbled. An Arab man seized it and held it high, and the sight of that one banner raised amid the Arab ranks did more to break Persian resolve than any single blade. When the moment that had seemed to be a question resolved into an answer, it was sudden and terrible in its ease. Where yesterday both sides had left the field with the sense that the war would go on in 1,000 small choices, the morning's small decisions, striking the elephants where they were vulnerable, cutting the rear, seizing a central point, added up and coalesced into something that could be called a rout. Not all the Persian forces fled. Many held with stubbornness born of loyalty and fear, and in their stand there were acts that would be told later with tears and with pride. But often, once the sense that the battle's heart had been pierced reached a man's ears, he saw not honor but the need to preserve what remained: horse, household, life. As the Persian center broke, men fled toward the river and toward the towns. The Euphrates echoed with the pounding of fleeing hooves and the sound of men who cried out for water and for mercy. In the Arab camp, the captured standards fluttered, and men pressed forward, not in reckless abandon, but with the measured hunger of those who had learned to make decisive advantage of confusion. They did not pursue all. They chose where to drive, which detachments to take, and which to let go. There were prisoners, and there were the dead. Faces turned to the plain like small tombstones. The young soldier lifted the standard he had captured and held it as if it were a thing of life. He searched the line for his brother and found him lying with eyes closed, mouth slack. His grief was immediate and physical, but beneath it there was also a strange relief that his brother had died with a sword in his hand. When the moment that had seemed to be a question resolved into an answer, it was sudden and terrible in its ease. Where yesterday both sides had left the field with the sense that the war would go on in 1,000 small choices, the morning's small decisions, striking the elephants where they were vulnerable, cutting the rear, seizing a central point, added up and coalesced into something that could be called a rout. Not all the Persian forces fled. Many held with stubbornness born of loyalty and fear, and in their stand there were acts that would be told later with tears and with pride. But often, once the sense that the battle's heart had been pierced reached a man's ears, he saw not honor, but the need to preserve what remained: horse, household, life. As the Persian center broke, men fled toward the river and toward the towns. The Euphrates echoed with the pounding of fleeing hooves and the sound of men who cried out for water and for mercy. In the Arab camp, the captured standards fluttered, and men pressed forward, not in reckless abandon, but with the measured hunger of those who had learned to make decisive advantage of confusion. They did not pursue all. They chose where to drive, which detachments to take, and which to let go. There were prisoners, and there were the dead. Faces turned to the plain like small tombstones. The young soldier lifted the standard he had captured and held it as if it were a thing of life. He searched the line for his brother and found him lying with eyes closed, mouth slack. His grief was immediate and physical, but beneath it there was also a strange relief that his brother had died with a sword in his hand. The tents, Persian, smoked where they had been burned at the edge, and where the Arab men moved through them, they found spoils and the artifacts of power, cloth, armor, insignias that had seemed imperishable. The mourning turned into a slow unmaking of what had the day before seemed like an inevitable future for an empire. It is not always armies that break an empire. Sometimes empires are undone by the contest of men who will not endure, by the unwillingness of nobles to submit to longer hardship, by the appetite of the victors to push where the vanquished cannot respond. By early afternoon, the plain had become a map of small human decisions: where to bury, where to tend, where to leave the dead unclaimed. Commanders on the Arab side gathered again, this time not merely to seize victory, but to choose what to do with it. Some counseled pursuit to the very gates of the next strongholds. Others, remembering the cost of overreach, argued for conquest of the supply towns and for consolidating the captured standards into secure positions. Saad listened to both and considered the larger theater. If Persia's heart was wounded here, then the governance of provinces might be a business of patient political moves rather than a single sweeping sword. Rostam lay dead in a tent that had once belonged to a house of silver. Men who had served him or been called by loyalty came and went, touching the edge of his garment as if touching an altar relic. Others, those who had looked to him for the order of law and fraction, fell into silence, and then, with an animal quickness, into rearrangement. Who would now claim the mantle? Who would ride to save what remained? The plain gave its answers in the way men scurried, in the way banners retreated, in the way towns prepared for what might come. Beyond the immediate aftermath, the consequences would ripple out. Noble houses would debate, provincial governors would send urgent letters to the capital, merchant caravans would reroute, and rumors would thicken in the bazaars. Men who had fought that day would carry their scars and their trophies into seasons that would not forget Qadisiyyah. A rout becomes history when chroniclers gather the pieces. For the living, it is memory and work and the raw business of surviving.
As the sun leaned toward evening and the Euphrates' breath cooled, those who had won sought shelter among the plunder and among the living. The young soldier sat with his brother's body between his knees, the standard across his lap, as if it could warm what was cold. He did not speak much. Words felt too thin. Around him, the camp settled into a watchful quiet, the sort that follows a day when much has been broken, and some measure of destiny has been altered. Commanders knew better than to declare the end. The Sassanian heart might yet contract and find new leaders. Provinces could close their gates and hold. A defeated state can be resilient in strange ways. But for the moment, the plain belonged to those who had the courage to press at the nodes. The evening fires reflected off shields and faces in a way that seemed to say both praise and misgivings. Victory here was now a ledger into which men would fit stories of courage, of error, of fate. They had turned a tactical advantage into something larger. But the true test would be in how they governed that advantage in the months that followed. Night descended with a newer, heavier sky. The Euphrates, patient as ever, carried waste and blood away in its slow current. Men wrapped themselves in blankets and prayed in their low voices, some to celebrate, some to bury, some to ask what the coming days would demand.
Beneath the tent poles and the stretch of blanket, the memory of a life like Rostam's lay still, vast in the retelling to come, while on the horizon the next set of choices waited, not yet visible to those who would have to make them.